Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on what is a rainy day here in Austin, Texas. My name is Corey Norton, and I have the pleasure of kicking off today's webinar, where we'll be discussing updates to the IIJA bill. Today, our panelists are going to cover a wide range of topics related to the state of IIJA, including an overview of the bill, important updates, how that impacts you and your agency, and what role technology plays in that landscape. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I want to remind you that this webinar will be recorded and will provide all participants with a recording and slides that we go over this afternoon. If you have any questions throughout the course of the conversation, and I hope you do, please submit them via the Q&A chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If we can't get to all of the questions during the available time, as always, we'll follow up with you to make sure that we get those questions answered for you. Now, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panelists for the day. First, we're delighted to have Lauren Shapker with us today, Vice President of Legislative Affairs at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. In her current role, Lauren is a key advocate for the transportation construction industry on Capitol Hill, working closely with legislators and their staff to advance industry priorities. Lauren has over a decade of experience in the transportation and infrastructure space, having previously led the transportation portfolio at the Portland Cement Association and directed legislative and regulatory portfolios at the National Groundwater Association. Throughout her career, Lauren has been instrumental in shaping transportation policy and increasing the profile of key infrastructure issues and stakeholders with national media. She currently resides in Alexandria, Virginia, with her husband and 2 children. So welcome, Lauren. Joining Lauren is Larry Flynn, the Chief Financial Officer for the Montana Department of Transportation, who's a highly experienced professional in the transportation and infrastructure sector. Mr. Flynn is also a member of the AASHTO Committee on Funding and Finance, where he contributes his expertise on financial matters. With over 29 years of experience at Montana DOT, Mr. Flynn has held various roles and has been an integral part of the agency's leadership team since 2001. During this time, he has represented the department and legislative committees, bringing his knowledge and experience to the table. Mr. Flynn holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from Montana State University, go Bobcats, and lives in the capital city of Helena with his wife and 2 children. So, Lauren, Larry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Finally, I would like to introduce our very own Senior Marketing Manager here at Origo, Stephanie Pedroza, who will kick off our discussion. Stephanie, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Corey. And welcome to everyone from my end. I also want to thank our experts for joining us and sharing your knowledge with our audience. And it's been about 2 years since the infrastructure bill has passed, and numerous changes and developments have happened since then. And in today's discussion, we're going to explore any project updates that have resulted from the implementation of the bill, how your agency can keep up with federal rules and regulations, aligning your capital programs with the bill's stipulations, and exploring role of technology in the overall process. But before we get started, we do want to launch a quick poll just to get to know who's in our audience. So if you can take the time to answer the poll, we want to know which of the following best describes your organization. And we'll give it a couple of seconds. If you can just go in and click what best describes who you're with. I think give it a couple more seconds. I always want to say minutes when we run the poll, but I know a minute is too long in the webinar, and we definitely don't want to run it for a minute. All right, it looks like we have about 60% of the attendees who submitted where they're from. Okay, so a good mix between roads and bridges, water, wastewater, transit, and rail, and other. Okay, and the next poll question is about your role. We want to know what best describes your role. Are you a project manager, capital planning and finance, an engineer, consultant, admin? or other. So if you can take the time and answer the poll above. So I'll give it a couple of seconds. We got about 50%, so I'm going to wait until we get a little more participation. All right, so, okay, a couple of project managers, capital planning and finance, some engineers, consultants, and admin. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll move on. So I want to spend a couple of minutes discussing the bill and what we know about the bill at this point. It's passed about 2 years ago, back in August of 2021. And the information that you see above, we got it from our partners at ARPA. So thank you so much for providing that information. And as we can see, the $1 trillion investment has funded a wide range of projects that includes roads, highways, transit, ports and airports, water, and rail. So it's been spread out through many agencies all over the US. And Lauren, I don't know if you want to give a little more insight into the investments and kind of where the money has been allocated.
Sure, Stephanie. So I would just quickly emphasize that you see all of these different buckets of money, but really at its core, the infrastructure bill is a 5-year surface transportation reauthorization. So while it gets all of this, kind of extra attention because it's a major infrastructure bill, and it is, with these investments, across broadband and energy and water, $450 billion, about half of the total pot of money is going to roads, bridges, and public transportation systems. So the other key thing I would just add on this slide is that we have $852 billion in guaranteed funding, which is just kind of the safe term that we like to use, because the way Congress works is that this law also had money that was subject to annual appropriations, requiring Congress to reapprove the money year after year. So we know that $852 billion is guaranteed, and then there's a couple $100 billion in addition to that that we hope Congress will continue to provide through the annual appropriations process.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that information. And now a little bit on the infrastructure bill projects and updates. The map above, you can see some of the projects throughout the U.S. that have been completed or in the process of completing. And overall, the bill has funded nearly 20,000 projects. And out of the $1 billion of infrastructure investments that have been completed, it supported at least 13,000 jobs, which is pretty phenomenal, because the whole point of the bill is not only to rebuild our country's infrastructure, but to also provide jobs for everyone in our nation since the pandemic. And I'm going to open up the poll question, and I'll start with you, Larry. What are your thoughts about the progress of the IIJA bill so far?
Well, first of all, I'd like to echo what Lauren said. At the root of this, it's still just a big reauthorization of our funding, and Montana has taken that approach that while there's some new pockets of money, some new requirements, at the heart, it just helps us fund our tremendous backlog of projects, and we're very grateful for that. For Montana, this will enable us to begin addressing the backlog of projects, specifically bridges. We have hundreds of load-posted bridges on and off system. Many of them are old timber bridges from the 30s in rural communities, with fuel alternatives to get products to market. So if we lose a bridge, there's a very long way around. So we're very grateful for the funding to be able to do that. Montana historically has been very deliberate in maintaining a solid inventory of shovel-ready and shovel-worthy projects. So we're pretty well positioned to get to work immediately on this increased funding level. But it really hasn't changed our priorities. It really hasn't done much to our program other than help offset the inflation. We do, as most of us do, kind of joke around about the big bag of inflation that this money is buying us. But the progression of the bill has been I think very solid, very good, and we were well positioned to take advantage of it. So we hit the ground running with this funding level and continue to do so.
Awesome. Well, and I'm glad that Montana is very well prepared for the money that came in. And then I'm going to pass the question over to you, Lauren. What are your thoughts about the progression of the bill so far?
Yeah, no, we've been very happy as well, especially as we're getting into year 2. We're really starting to see things pick up steam. In year 1, we were a little disappointed that Congress spent about 6 extra months appropriating the money. So states were really hamstrung in year 1 to get that money obligated, but they did it. They worked quickly because they had, a tremendous backlog, like Larry mentioned, to really start putting this money towards projects. So, I always think it's interesting, the administration, you have cites 20,000 projects. We're keeping track of projects as well, and we think that number is actually closer to 37,000 at this point. So we're really happy to see the amount of work that's going out the door. We know that there's about 7,000 more projects underway than would previously be underway under FAST Act levels of funding. So states are putting more and more work out the door and getting to that point that you made, Stephanie, about workforce and putting people to work.
Awesome. And another question, what do you think has worked well with the bill so far? I know you said that the first year there were a little hiccups, but now going into year 2, it's moving a lot smoother. And what are areas of opportunity where agencies can help make the most of the investment moving forward? Because there's 3 years left in the bill. And Lauren, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that since you discussed it earlier.
Yeah, no, I would say what's worked well is this emphasis on the formula programs that's really giving states the latitude to do what they're good at, which is knowing their state and knowing what areas need an emphasis. So 87% of the money is going out via formula programs. And most of these programs are well known in the states. Like Larry said, this isn't completely upending, Montana DOT's day to day because they are familiar with these programs. Now they just have more money. So we think that's the crux of why this bill is going to be such a success. On the flip side of things, areas of improvement, the money gets a lot of the attention, but there's a lot of policy in this as well. And a lot of that policy is still being implemented as we're well into year 2 already. So that's been a big challenge. There are programs that are just now getting the guidance released, like some of the EV charging standards that just came out. Those came out a month or 2 ago, but states are already, a year and a half into having to spend that $5 billion to build out these networks. The expansion of the Buy America program is still being figured out, even though we're a year and a half into things. So I think making sure that states are confident in how they can spend the resources is going to be really critical, and getting that regulatory certainty, that policy certainty piece in place will certainly help in the next few years.
Thanks. And Larry, I don't know if you want to add to that. What do you think are some areas of opportunity and what has worked well with the infrastructure bill investments?
I want to know how Lauren got on my speaking notes, because everything that she's pointed out is exactly how we're seeing things too. So at the risk of repeating, from a state perspective, we are always looking for bills that have way more state control with fewer rigid requirements. The sluggishness of the guidance has been kind of a challenge. The one size fits all for a very, very large rural state like Montana. We're geographically, we're the 4th largest state, only behind Alaska, California, and Texas. But yet we have just barely over 1 million people, a lot of roads coming through Montana. Probably the eastern half of the state has a population of less than 100,000 in the eastern half of the state, which is larger than several states on the eastern seaboard. So some of the policies that come through and some of the rigid requirements are directed at very real problems in very metropolitan areas that don't really apply to rural Montana. So some of that can be a little frustrating at times. One of the other kind of side effects of the bill was with the large funding that came out with this bill, which is, again, very well appreciated. We're seeing these kind of upticks in our August redistribution dollars. Montana has always leveraged those very well. We've been very, very happy recipients of those dollars that come out at the end of the year. But we're kind of reaching that point where the saturation of the obligation authority, or the apportionment, is not keeping pace with these large obligation authority balances coming through August redistribution. So we're getting to that point where we won't be able to leverage those to the degree that we used to. But yeah, I think obviously more upsides than downsides. Couldn't have been more timely with the inflationary pressures we're seeing now. This will at least help us maintain a program, if not hopefully grow it into the future.
Okay, and both of you mentioned kind of rearranging or making the most out of your obligations, where right now you can't rearrange your obligations to actually make that money go through. I don't know if either Lauren or Larry, if you can elaborate on that. I guess, what can agencies do to be prepared when that time comes to do all of that?
Well, I think, again, you just have to have a solid project plan and understand where your priorities are. Again, we made it our policy basically to keep that backlog, so as these dollars come out, we can leverage them. But we do so in a manner that doesn't, that we don't have to disrupt our core program, right? We kind of build those assumptions into our core capital program so that we're not necessarily held hostage by those balances, but we can take advantage of them as they come up. We can just take the next projects off the shelf and keep moving on that backlog rather than scrambling around. We do like the formula, the large formula aspect of this bill, so we're not having to compete on a national scale. I mean, there's that opportunity as well, which we can get into in a minute. But by and large, we just have to stay true to ourselves and make sure that we understand our priorities, so that we can, rather than see it as a negative that we can't deliver it, we need to be thankful for the times that we can and just keep true to ourselves.
And I would just add that a couple of the new formula programs are different in that they have the full, 4 years or 5 years to spend that formula money. So the new bridge formula program and the new EV charging formula program, they aren't subject to that same, annual obligations limit that some of the other core formula programs are. So that's a big help too. And it's actually, I think, a blessing that so many states have such a large backlog of projects, because they're really being able to work through those. So finally making that, a good thing rather than just, a sore spot.
Yeah, and always look at the positives. There's more projects that can go through. And we're going to discuss a little bit about federal rules and reporting. And we've heard from a lot of agencies that rules and reporting can be a challenge. So I want to, open up the question to our audience. Since the bill has passed, what has been the biggest challenge you have experienced with federal rules and guidelines? Is it that guidelines aren't clear, guidelines are coming out too late, reporting can be cumbersome, or you haven't really experienced any challenges with the reporting since the bill has passed? And if the audience can take a couple of seconds to answer the poll. Looks like about 10% of our audience has answered the poll question. So if you guys could take a couple of seconds to just click which best applies. Give it a couple more seconds. And I guess I'll ask Larry while we run the poll question, but what have you seen Montana areas of opportunity with federal rules and reporting and guidelines, and how you guys are maintaining and keeping up with them?
So I think the most important thing is just to develop and maintain those strong working relationships with your federal partners. We meet regularly and intentionally with our division office here, our FHWA division office. They're literally about 2 blocks away from us here in Helena, and we really consider them as an extension of our team. So participate in those dialogues, participate in, for our case, we have several representatives on the Funding and Finance Committee. We keep that dialogue open. Just making sure it's more of a conversation than a one-way kind of dictation of the rules and regs. We want to just maintain that dialogue. I know that sounds very high level, but that's essentially what it comes down to, I think.
And it looks like a lot of the issues are guidelines aren't clear. And I've heard that a lot from a lot of agencies that the guidelines aren't quite clear. Guidelines are come out too late. We all know that reporting in general can be very cumbersome, so that makes sense. And around federal rules and reporting and funding, I'm going to ask you, Lauren, how can agencies stay up to date with the rules and regulations, and what are some key resources that agencies can use to find this information or rely on this information?
Yeah, I mean, I do this for a living, and I would say it's incredibly hard and cumbersome to follow all of this stuff. So I totally understand the challenges that a lot of state agencies are having. I would say that at a very basic level, finding the time with someone on your staff to go through that federal register every day, it's tedious. It's rarely very interesting, but a lot of times it does give you a heads up when things are coming down the pike, whether it's going to be a grant announcement. I will say that the White House and DOT have done a great job at trying to be more proactive and giving people advance notice. So, the IIJA's website at USDOT has a calendar where you can follow their planned schedule of grant announcements for the year. I'll say they don't always keep up with that, planned announcement, but at least it gives you the general time of year to expect some of these announcements. I'd be remiss if I didn't plug some of the, ARPA resources that we have free and available. And we've got a team here that works on regulatory issues and is always reporting on our developments and engagement with the White House, with federal agencies on issues like One Federal Decision or on Buy America. So would encourage you to check that out, as well as our highway dashboard, which tracks all of these projects to really see how the money's, flowing and getting out to the states. But beyond that too, your other agency stakeholders, each state has their own way of doing things. To the extent you're not already engaging with AASHTO and ARPA and like-minded industry groups, I would say they are a tremendous resource as well to share success stories and horror stories about how things have been going.
And I think everyone can learn from both success stories and from your peers on what works best when it comes to rules and reporting. And Larry, in your experience, what are some of the biggest compliance challenges from obtaining funds from the bill that you have seen at Montana or you've heard from your peers?
Typically we don't have tremendous challenges. I think Buy America is a big one that seems to plague everyone a little bit. And again, the exceptions to that and the guidance that comes out has been a little bit hit and miss. So we struggle a little bit with that. But by and large, we don't have. Again, our program is very rural. So we concentrate on a lot of pavement and bridges, and that's a lot of what we do. That's the lion's share of what we do in Montana. So we typically don't struggle to the same degree, I think, with the compliance that a lot of states do.
Okay, and then Lauren, I don't know if you want to add or elaborate on that to see what are some biggest compliance challenges for obtaining the funds that you've seen, since you're right there with all the compliance and reporting.
Yeah, I mean, one challenge that I think we hear time and again is on the discretionary grant side of things, actually finding the time and the resources to put together an application, especially, now last year was the first time they combined 3 grant programs into one application, which in some ways is great because, you're not applying 3 different times, but it puts a lot more pressure on getting a complete application together, as well as making sure that your application fits all of the criteria that are required by the administration. So, certain grant programs fit really well into the administration's priorities. Other programs, you're kind of finding a way to fit a square peg into a round hole to claim that, this project is also going to do these 5 or 6 things. So I know that's something that, particularly as there's more eligibility for local, county, not just state agencies to apply, there's a real challenge in having the expertise and the technical abilities to get strong grant applications in and really compete for that money.
Hey, Stephanie, I could just add to that real quick too. so the grant applications, the discretionary grants, what we're finding in Montana is we have actually not been successful in a single grant application yet from the state perspective, but we partner quite a bit with our local transportation entities, our cities and counties, and those applications have been better received, we feel, from the federal government. We're working closely with them and seeing tremendous success rate with that. The other thing that kind of goes along with that, and one thing we struggled with through our legislative session early on this time was, well, two things. One is translating the impacts of this legislation into the state appropriation that's necessary to get it spent, helping them understand the timelines and the implications of a long-term capital program. Again, for us, it's business as usual. We understand that it's an extension of our regular infrastructure program. But for many of the agencies involved, it's kind of one-time money, and it's new and it's fresh and it's shiny. And they try to appropriate that a little bit differently. So having that dialogue and working with our decision makers in the Capitol to make sure that they understand how the program works for us. And then right along with that is, of course, the matching fund implications of doing this. And we can articulate that pretty well for the formula-based program, right? That there's kind of a one-to-one. You're going to have a program that grows at 20% in the case of this bill. So you can kind of translate that into a 20% increase in match. But where we struggled a little bit was not knowing what type of discretionary funding we would be receiving. We're obviously, and I couldn't agree more with the application process. That takes a lot of resources. So not understanding what we would be resource enabled to apply for and what we'd be successful with, and then trying to translate that into what the matching requirements would be from a state perspective were really challenging. And in Montana, our matching source is limited to gas tax, state gas tax only. We don't have any other revenue source that comes into the department for match. So having those discussions was very interesting. Fortunately, in Montana's case, we had a very large general fund surplus for a lot of reasons. And we actually passed a bill this session that transferred $100 million of that surplus to a fund that would help us match specifically any of the August redistribution or grab bag money and any discretionary grants that came in. So it's one pot of money. We can use up to $15 million a year out of that $100 million. It's interest earning. So that gets us about 7 years worth of match for what we anticipate for incoming grab bag or discretionary funding. But state match is a huge consideration for Montana, and I believe for lots of other states on how we're going to get there.
Awesome. Well, thanks. That was a lot of valuable information, and I think it's you're constantly learning because there's always something happening. There's so many sources of funding that are coming through. And we're going to move on to the bill and your capital programs. And I know aligning your capital programs with the regulations and the stipulations of the bill is something that's very important, especially to receive funding. And since the bill has passed, how do you feel that it's impacted the planning and execution of capital programs? And I'm going to hand it over to Larry, since you're in the planning and the finance department of Montana, and you said it really hasn't impacted much, but have you seen like there just be any type of change around there?
Again, the bill didn't really impact our capital program in terms of priorities. It did enable us to get a few more projects out on the ground. So from the navigating the bill standpoint, it's been it hasn't been super challenging, but of course, like everyone on the call, it comes down to resources and understanding the saturation point of our contractors in Montana. We only have really 2 large bridge contractors in the state, so that the execution of the program, I feel at some point is going to present us some challenges. We work very closely with our contractor association to understand what that saturation point is. They're getting that point too, where they're like, man, I don't know how much more work we can take on. Of course, getting back to the decision makers, there was such a push to get these dollars out so quickly. They wanted to see, shovels in the ground right away, and that just doesn't align itself well with trying to plan out this program. So these kind of compressed timeframes that we have to deliver projects, that can be a challenge for us from a deliverability standpoint.
And then, Lauren, what are some strategies that you think that will help agencies stay compliant with the bill's regulations?
Yeah, I mean, before I jump there, if I could just build on something Larry was saying, I do think, there is a short time horizon that it seems like with this 5 years of funding, but at the same time, it's 5 years of funding certainty after a series of short-term extensions. So we have been able to see in states across the country, they're having the confidence to advance some of these large projects that may have been on the sidelines previously. So we know that, in 2021, there are only about 70 large projects of 50 million or more that are being advanced. But in last year, there were 105 of these large projects. So we're seeing some of the major improvements that might have stayed on the sidelines if there was uncertainty with funding, getting the green light to move ahead. So that's something that we're certainly watching as states try to manage, but we wholeheartedly agree with you on the workforce side of things. We're hearing that a lot, that the workforce tends to always ramp up, but this is a lot of money and it's all at once. So how can we get the labor and the equipment and the people to make all of these projects a reality? So it's definitely something we're spending a lot of time on. On the compliance side of things, I think it's one thing we haven't talked about so far is engaging with your state infrastructure coordinator. This is somebody that the White House asked every state to appoint. The governors appoint this person. Sometimes it's an independent position. Sometimes it's somebody who's taking on a new hat. But I would say that these are really the people in every state that are trying to make sure this bill is successful. So to the extent you can work with them, see where you're having compliance challenges, and seeing what help or resources they can provide that you might not be aware of would be a good place to start.
Okay. And I think that's something that can be another big discussion is how to utilize your resources to make the most out of these funds, because you're having a lot of money coming in. Now, here's my question. It's been 2 years since the bill has passed. It's 3 more years. Does that mean that there's 3 more years left for all the states and agencies to complete these projects? Or what's going to happen once the 5-year period stops?
So it's really just about obligating the funds. And so that's basically, tagging them to specific projects. And it's usually small phases of projects. So, we wouldn't expect like the Brent Spence Bridge in Cincinnati, Ohio. It doesn't have to be done by the end of the 5 years, but it's got this grant that's got a timeline with it. Any subsequent formula funds are going to have to be obligated by the state, saying that, we've set aside this money for this purpose. And then the work is done and the contractors are reimbursed.
All right, and before we move on to the next topic, it looks like there's a couple of questions coming in. So we will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So definitely keep them coming in. And now the next is around technology in your capital programs. And technology can always be really, really helpful, but it can also be a big growing pain when it comes to implementing. So a question that I have for my panelists: how is technology changing the way we approach capital programs, and what are some trends that you're seeing shaping the future of this field? And Larry, I'll start with you with that question.
So one thing that, and again, coming from the CFO perspective rather than maybe the operational end, but one thing that we continue to struggle with and that we're very engaged in now is how do we manage all, we have oodles and oodles and oodles of systems. So how do we manage those multiple systems and connect them together to form what I call the single source of truth, having a very focused data set that can drive management decisions. We have, I call it the drip model. We are data rich and information poor. We have lots and lots and lots of data. We gather lots of stuff, but how we coordinate that, how we assimilate that and boil it down to solid information is critical. So we're undergoing a few upgrades, technology upgrades on our management systems to try to get to that point. We're trying to retire multiple legacy systems, some of them that were built in the 70s, and trying to boil this down to just a handful of systems that can do all this. So I was trying to come up with something, if we're on the DRIP model now, I was trying to come up with a new cool acronym for what that would look like if we got past the DRIP. So bear with me, but I came up with Gusher. It's genuinely useful and shared, holistically enabling results. That's the kind of information we want. We want to go to a Gusher model where we can in very real time and very nimble time be able to communicate with agency leadership, with legislative decision makers, with their congressional delegation, and to really talk about where we need to focus our efforts on. Our current governor is an entrepreneur. He developed a very large software company, and he's very results driven. He's very data driven. Everything that we go to him with and ask for help, the first thing he wants is to see the data, and we have to be able to respond to that. We can't take weeks on end to pull data and assimilate it and decide what's the truth and what's not. So that's kind of where we're spending our efforts on. In terms of the operational side, there's a lot more going on that end, but from the administrative side, that's kind of our focus right now, is getting to that single source of truth.
Now, you had the audience talking about Gusher. Can you say what Gusher means again? We're probably going to have to write that down into everyone's email, and a lot of state agencies will be using that.
Oh man! So I just came up with this morning. It's genuinely useful and shared, holistically enabling results.
Okay.
So it's use it for what you will, but that's what I came up with this morning. But since we're going to be talking acronyms, I'll also make my pitch that I believe that IIJA should actually be pronounced IIJA, but I'm having a hard time getting that off the ground too. So maybe you guys can help me with that.
I've had a couple of struggles saying IIJA, especially when you're doing a lot of public speaking. And we did have a panel where they just said the bill. So I think that's a little easier. We might use IIJA. And Lauren, I'm going to ask you this question. When it comes to technology investments, being that there's a lot of options, how should agencies tackle technology when it comes to the bill and capital programs?
Yeah, so I think two things come to mind. The first is, making sure that you're taking advantage of what formula funds you might be able to use to support, technology upgrades. This was something I was surprised to see when we were going through, how every state spent their formula dollars. You always assume it's on, repaving projects, bridges, right-of-way purchases, but there were some states that spent a lot of money on technology upgrades. So that would be one thing that I would just flag, because I know getting the money to actually make the upgrade is the first of several difficult steps. The other technology-related thing I would just flag is that we're seeing a lot of digitization in the NEPA process. This is something that I know as an organization, ARPA would like to see, because that NEPA process takes such a long time before you can even get to the construction side of things. So finding ways that you can put NEPA documents in the cloud is something that we're working with members of Congress on a lot too, because if we can speed up that process, get that concurrent review among federal agencies going faster, we can hopefully really bring down that average time of an environmental assessment, which is like 5 to 7 years. So the IIJA had a goal of bringing that down to 2 years. We think technology could go a long way to helping us reach that 2-year goal.
Yeah, and it's the thing with technology is trying to minimize the time and saving time as well as money. And I'm going to open that question to you as well, Larry. How should states be thinking about investing in technology to help with capital programs and the IIJA bill, as you'd like to call it?
IIJA, yeah.
IIJA.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add to that. obviously technology is a big part of our lives, and we need to embrace that. Again, Montana, being such a large rural state, our needs are fairly simplistic, but I think where our technology needs are more on the administrative end and being able to tie our systems together and be able to leverage our technology a little bit better. Again, we collect we have a lot of systems, but we don't do a great job at tying them together and making them talk.
Okay. And I believe that's all the questions. I don't know if you have anything else to add in terms of just the IIJA bill in general and what agencies should be looking out for in the next 3 years. And Laura, I don't know if you have any other information you'd like to share.
I would just say, continue to keep your eye out, because as much has happened already, there are major programs that we haven't even seen get off the ground yet, whether it's the Protect program for resiliency. That's a major grant program that they said was going to be released this spring. We still haven't seen anything, and that resiliency focus, I think, is really going to be a priority, and this is supposed to be the hallmark program to help us start to achieve that. So I would just say continue to keep your eyes out for things, because there's a lot that you all are already staying more than busy with, I'm sure, but there is certainly more to come. And that goes for the regulatory side of things as well. Hopefully there's more certainty to look out for as we progress throughout the rest of this year on issues like one federal decision and Buy America. I think the administration knows that there's a need from states and industry to have certainty. So we're just waiting on them to hopefully provide that to us.
All right, and we'll open it up to audience questions. So I'll transfer it over to you, Corey.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. A lot of really good questions. So kick things off, Lauren, you talked a lot about funding and allocation at the beginning of this presentation. So some of the IIJA or IIJA funds are allocated across states by formula, while others require state and local governments to apply for funding. How well do you think that process is working? What's been your experience there?
So I would say on one hand, it's working well, because when we look at the awards that have been made, I think the administration is going to great strides on discretionary grants to make sure that they're evenly dividing the money between rural and urban areas. The flip side of things, I would say that where things aren't working so well is that, like Larry mentioned, it's an incredible amount of resources needed to put together a great grant application. And there's a lot of places that simply aren't going to be able to take the time or to have the staff on hand to put together a strong grant application. The other part that I would hopefully like to see some improvement on is getting these grants out the door. We are still seeing grant announcements, just notices of funding for grants using FY22 money, which, that year ended several months ago at this point. So the fact that they are still trying to spend FY22 money while we're midway through FY23, and it'll be FY24 before you know it. So hopefully they will start picking up steam a bit on actually making the awards.
That's great. So kind of along that topic, you mentioned there are a lot of resources needed to put together a strong grant application. And Larry, I want to open up this to you as well, in case you've had this experience with Montana DOT, but is there anything the private sector can do to help city and state agencies put together those grant applications?
Again, just kind of comes back to partnering, right? Understanding the availability of resources. So, for instance, in Montana, we don't compete real well for the big projects, right? We don't have a lot of massive projects that could draw either the attention of feds in terms of awarding those grants or the contracting community itself. So I mentioned our timber bridges. We have a lot of old timber bridges throughout the state that are in pretty rough shape. So rather than try to address those one at a time, what we're trying to do is bundle those together and hopefully draw a more attractive grant application, as well as try to draw more interest from the private sector. So understanding the appetite and the scalability of those, and working with our private sector partners to do that is critical, to understand what they can actually deliver, and just keep that dialogue going so we know how to scale those grant applications to make them more attractive.
Yeah, I think that's really good insight.
And I would add, from the private sector's perspective, anything that if you have a business that's going to be positively impacted by one of these grants, having letters of support that you can submit with that application is going to really strengthen your shot. Just making sure that there's a business case to be made outside of just the jobs created on the project, but the economic benefits that will come to the private sector after a project's completed will certainly strengthen your case.
Agreed.
Really insightful. So, Larry, you mentioned earlier about inflation. So, are you seeing that, or what effect do you think higher inflation and labor shortages and everything that government agencies are going through? How do you think that affects local infrastructure spending? Infrastructure spending as a whole.
Well, obviously, we're the offset between the increase in funding and the inflationary pressures. It's about a wash. I think there's this propensity, or there was early on in coming out of COVID, and when we first started to see these massive supply chain shortages and the inflationary pressures. I think there's this propensity to hold off and kind of ride the storm out, which I think has made it a little worse. Kind of getting off of our horizontal construction, but even our facilities. We had some very large facility projects, internal projects to the agency that we pushed out, 2 years, 3 years, trying to ride out the storm, and now that's kind of clogged up that bottleneck even worse. That now that we're those projects are getting down to criticality, and now we're trying to shove those down through. So I think obviously it stands to say that there's massive implications to the inflationary pressures, and I just don't see them going away. I mean, we may see a bit of a mild recession. We may see some flattening of that inflation, but I don't think we're ever going to see costs go down to where they were before. And I think we just need to accept that as the new reality. Inflation and how to apply inflation to our state appropriations was a topic of massive discussion this time. We saw inflationary adjustments in our budget that I've never seen in my career here, and probably never will. I hope I never do. So just understanding that it's a permanent reality and starting to plan for that rather than riding out the storm, I think, is key.
Yeah, I think, nail on the head, getting ahead of it, planning for it, and accepting that is the reality of where we are. So, really, really insightful. Thank you. So one more question here, and I think both of you kind of talked to or alluded to this earlier around the policies like Build America, Buy America that are kind of in place and a part of this process to get this funding. So Lauren, what effect, or can you elaborate a little bit more on the effects that you're seeing that have on the willingness to take on IIJA funds, IIJA funds?
Yeah, it's certainly, I would say, what we hear the most from our members, our contractors, is the challenge and the uncertainty around Buy America. On one hand, we've thankfully been dealing with this as a policy for decades, and we've been supportive of it as a policy for decades. But it's really now the uncertainty around construction materials and what that means, which is still up for debate. So ARTBA and its partners, work to get things like asphalt, cement, aggregates excluded from the definition of construction materials. So it was our understanding that those would be not included as a part of Buy America compliance, but now it seems like we're hearing slightly different things from the administration. So we're trying to stay ahead of that. We're trying to stay ahead of, the issue of manufactured products waiver, which is currently being revisited for the first time in 40 years. So well, I don't think it's going to detract from anyone actually taking on funds or projects. It might just delay a project. It might just, cause a contractor a lot of heartburn if they're trying to determine if this, box of bolts that they bought at Home Depot is Buy America compliant or not. So it's a lot of unknowns. I think once there is certainty, then, things will be cleared up. But right now we're in this weird limbo where there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of administrative action where we could use some certainty.
I think that lends itself to that poll question that we asked earlier, and one of the big things was confusion around what the policies are, how do we adhere to these things. So it seems like that's
looking for the all of the above poll question option, which y'all didn't have.
Yeah,
I think that
probably should have put all of the above next time. But I think that concludes our panel discussion, and I want to thank the panelists and hopefully the audience, you found this very beneficial. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. And be on the lookout for our next webinar. If you're with a water agency, we're going to be discussing how to better improve our water infrastructure and make it more resilient, since now one of the bill's priorities is resiliency, as Lauren had mentioned, and I've heard a lot and just read a lot about resiliency, and building more resilient infrastructure is going to be very, very important. And once again, this webinar is recorded, so you will be getting an email with the recordings and the PowerPoint presentations. And have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.